So without further ado, I'm going to introduce our last speakers for MY's breakout sessions, Lyle Sutton and Tim Ramsey, and I will hand it over to them. Thank you so much for joining us today. They are my colleagues from Mandiant, now part of Google Cloud, and they're going to kick us out on the highest note. So thank you, gentlemen.
All right. Thank you, Catherine, and thank you all for actually coming to a last keynote, or at least a last breakout session right in front of the keynotes. So yeah, welcome everyone. Welcome to How to Win Friends, Influence People, and Actually Inform Your Business About Cybersecurity Risks. My name is Lyle Sutton.
And I'm Tim Ramsey.
So both of us have a few decades of cybersecurity experience working across different industries, companies of different sizes. And one common challenge that we see many organizations that they face is just the deal of how you actually communicate cybersecurity risks, how you work with the business, how you communicate this stuff. It's something that it seems to be a problem that everyone is facing these days, and it's something that we've seen exacerbated just as companies have really changed with technology. Our goal here is to pass along some tips and tricks that we've actually used throughout our careers, give you some real-world examples, including some of the challenges that we've actually faced ourselves. The message you'll hear from us is that pretty much everything we discuss is also needs to be tailored for your organization. Just because it's something that actually worked for us doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to work directly for you. So what we want to do is try and give you a wide breadth of different types of experiences that we've run into, different types of companies, and then ideally you can pick and choose from this to come up with something that's actually going to work in your environment. And also we'll leave plenty of time at the end for questions, so please hold any questions to the end. So what are we actually going to cover? So the title of the talk isn't just this pithy marketing term, but business friends, positive influence, these are things that are integral to not only delivering the right message regarding cybersecurity risk, but also essential towards building an effective cybersecurity program, developing a culture of cybersecurity excellence, and communicating cybersecurity risk to business leaders and boards of directors. Companies that are able to successfully identify and prioritize cybersecurity risks across the enterprise, they can achieve this by creating an environment where security is just simply part of the culture. Winning friends.
Well, good morning, everyone. As I mentioned, I'm Tim Ramsey, and I'm a 3-time CISO. My first CISO gig was at the University of Miami, where I'd been for 26 years and was named the CISO by the author of HIPAA, Dr. Donna Shalala, when she arrived. And that was a collection of different things that we had done, but there was no program. Next, I was the CISO at World Fuel, a $40 billion Fortune 90 company operating in 210 countries and territories. And like at I was the first named CISO at World Fuel. Then in 2020, I went on to ChinMed, a value-based healthcare provider, and was their first named CISO. So I have a lot of experience at the board level, but also from the operational ground up, building the program from the firewalls to the endpoint to the actual governance and the board presentations. And so when we think about how we consider friends, I want to start with the CFO of World Fuel who called me into his office the first week I was at World Fuel. And he said, Tim, do you want to know why your predecessor was never named CISO? Well, he pulled out his iPhone and he goes, there are some security gaps here, and I don't want to go into them. And I've told your predecessor about them. I'm not going to go back and tell him again. I need you to listen, and I need you to follow through. I asked him, did you ever tell him? And he goes, that's not my job. If you want to be a CISO, I need to be able to depend upon you and trust you. He invited me later that week to go to a CFO-only meeting, talking about Sarbanes-Oxley and cybersecurity. On the way back in the car, he said, Tim, every quarter, we're a publicly traded company, and I, along with Michael, our CEO, do the readout on our quarterly earnings report. Everyone in our 210 countries and territories knows who I am. No one knows you. Why don't you ghostwrite whatever it is you want to say? Do it as a trilogy, and I'll sign my name to it. It set the table for my entire program as CISO there, vicariously through the CFO, aligned with him, but my words. And so when you think about friends, consider the structures and functions adjacent to cyber. HR, general counsel, internal audit, disaster recovery, physical security. These are individuals who do not need to be persuaded to get on the cybersecurity bus. They are already on it. But two requirements and two things that they were going to look at you for. One, is it all about you and the cyber program? Or do you care as much about their agenda and what they're trying to do on their access control readers and their cameras, or what they're trying to do with new hire orientation? Or is it all about you? And the second thing is, particularly at the C level, they want to know that you care more about the business than you do about your cyber program agenda. And will step aside for the sake of the business to achieve an objective that maybe puts what you're trying to do on the back burner. Now, I'm not saying you step away or back off on any of the things that are a risk, but there is an aura, an aroma that you carry with you. Is it about you? Is it about your program and your career? Or is it about the business? That's the key to influence.
So why should you really care? So one key area is that organizations are really changing. It used to be that security was kind of its often its own silo. We were kind of almost like the nerds in the basement. And security was trusted. Okay, you guys go, you keep us safe, you go do your thing. And that's what technology leaders just kind of expected us to do. And that's kind of what we did. But now organizations are really changing and evolving to integrate security as part of the overall business. And that means that as security professionals, we also have to change how we talk. How do we engage with the business? How do we learn about the business? And so as we're really driving towards that integration, we also have to ensure that we're learning the language of the business. That's why we need to make sure that we're looking at not only just the security silo, but the overall business impact itself. Think about breaches. Pretty much everyone these days, it's not just security professionals, are aware of breaches. How many people in this room have had their information compromised by some breach at some point? I'm willing to bet pretty much everyone in here. There have been breaches in government agencies. There have been breaches in credit reporting agencies. There's so much information that companies have about us, and much of this information has been compromised and released as part of these breaches. Everyone, it doesn't matter whether you're a security professional or you're a business leader, you're aware of these breaches now. And so that calculus is really changing the conversation for security because of the awareness, because business leaders are starting to understand the impact to the business. And so that's why aligning and finding these business friends are so important, because it's going to help you, it's going to help security, it's going to help the business. And just like real friends, when there's a situation, you want the friends to be there for you.
So that's an inner circle, a group of friends that you're going to see regularly. And without really even trying, in almost every organization that I've been a CISO, actually it's true, that I was regularly in contact with general counsel, regularly in contact with HR, but how do you influence an organization that's 70,000 people globally, or 50,000 or 100,000, most of whom you will never meet, you will never shake hands, they will not get to see you except maybe vicariously through a Zoom or some type of Teams conversation. And so the key is here is to delegate and share the microphone. You need to find people that can carry your message where it needs to be. Let's face it, we're all an acquired taste. I resonate very well with certain people. And then for others, it's, whatever. It's not working. I like to tell stories. Other people have a different communication style. And instead of making it about you or yourself and being defensive or insecure about it, embrace a team that can move the culture, that can create a movement that is bigger than yourself. And so in 2014, let me give you an example. In 2014, I was the CISO at the University of Miami, and we had an incident with direct deposit fraud in Workday. It was not great. Our solution was to implement mandatory multi-factor authentication. Well, anyone here work in higher ed with tenure-track faculty? Okay. They have tenure-track faculty have basically a lifetime career guarantee, and they can speak truth to power and say, no, I'm not doing that, and get away with it. They have a different drug test. They have a different set of HR. It's super hard, and I was one step away from getting the entire organization to move to MFA, but I had to go to the faculty senate. And at the University of Miami, there was a PhD, MD, who came up to me and he said, Tim, I admire what you're trying to do, and I'm on board, but you don't want to go in there and speak to that group. Why don't you let me be the one to deliver your points? What I thought was a 30-minute presentation, he had in 15 minutes, because he had the union card. He was a PhD and an MD, and that MFA went through like silk. And at the end, I was thinking, but I'm the CISO. I'm the Chief Information Security. Isn't that enough? And, I think for those of you who think that your world would be much better if you just had the title CISO, because you'd have the hammer, or if you are a CISO today and you're buried under that CIO who's got his own agenda, if you could only report to the CEO, I'm here to tell you on this side of it that positional authority has a half-life. Every time you rely upon that to get your way, to say, because I said so, you have less. Real credibility is how you drive influence. You earn credibility by listening, even to your detractors, and especially your detractors, because people in the room are watching how you take a punch. Do you get defensive? Do you get argumentative? Do you get nervous? Is it obvious that they're getting to you? Or like the PhD MD, is he seeing what you're trying to do, and he sees that you're somebody he wants to get behind because you're standing up for what's right. Not everyone's going to, but that is where you need your friends to help you with the rest of the messaging. Sometimes the feedback from your detractors is even more important than that from your friends who are sugarcoating and they don't want to hurt your feelings. Listen to that feedback and adapt. Listening, 2 ears, 1 mouth, that's the ratio.
Yeah, and ideally, everyone could actually be your friend. You can identify those shared objectives, really work towards it, but in the real world, it doesn't work that way. So ideally, this is why you really need to look at influence. It allows you to really amplify your message. And that's what allows the true influence to actually come out, is that real amplification. And there's a number of different techniques that some companies use. So some companies have an informal notion of a security champion. These are people who are embedded across the different business lines. They might be a software developer lead. They might be someone who works on the operations side. But these are people who actually might be interested in security. These are people who actually might be somewhat knowledgeable about security. But more importantly, they're willing to work with you. They're willing to be a liaison between the security team and whatever team that they're a part of. This is not something that they're doing and getting paid extra for. This is something that they're doing because they generally actually care. And those are wonderful people to use to help amplify your own message and really drive some of that influence. Another more formal method is BISOs, so business line security leaders. In this case, this is a formal way to actually designate someone in the business line to actually be the security liaison, and they're the ones who are embedded in the team. They're the ones who are responsible for ensuring that the teams understand the security requirements, the teams understand what's expected of them, and that's another way that you can formally drive that influence. And yet another third way is actually security awareness and training. So every company these days has security awareness and training. Every company has a formal method to actually instruct people about different areas of security. And so that's a great way to magnify your message as well, is bringing whatever information that you want, bringing that out to the individuals, and ideally even tailoring that to different roles. So depending on if you're a system administrator, you're an operations expert, you're an HR, whatever it might be, that's the way to really tailor the message to ensure that you're getting the right message across as part of that awareness and training. And it's also important to remember that it's not personal. It's bigger than you. What you're trying to drive here is you're trying to drive change. You're trying to build a momentum. You're trying to actually start a movement going on. And so, like Tim mentioned before, it's not about, oh, I'm the CISO, you have to listen to me. It's about what you're trying to actually achieve and using indirect methods in order to try and achieve that.
It's a great point, Lyle. So let's talk about an example. In my last CISO role, I started in January of 2021, and COVID was hot. We were going through a period of rapid growth, hyper-growth as we were calling it at ChinMed, and it was 50 new hires a week, going through new hire orientation. And people sometimes were getting their laptop FedEx to them, and it arrived before they got to new hire orientation, and sometimes not. And then sometimes our clinicians, when they were coming on board, they weren't getting access to their applications in some cases 40 days after they started. And so they were not being productive or effective. And it was frustrating for HR. It was frustrating for the desktop HR infrastructure people. And it isn't, what's the point? It wasn't a cyber risk. It wasn't something on my agenda. And I picked it as a problem to solve. And we used Okta and Zscaler, and essentially what happened was we created a way for whatever device you were using to get you through new higher orientation, then to be able to get immediate access to your applications. It was an overwhelming success. Was there any risk mitigation that took place? Maybe, I could argue, but fundamentally it was about problem solving. It was about sending a message to HR and to infrastructure. I know how to fix this, I know how to be helpful, I know how to pull together a project, and I delivered results that helped me for the rest of the time I was there because it built such reciprocity in terms of support for something that made me a go-to person for problem solving, whether it was cyber or not. That's what you need to be perceived as to be a real leader. How many CISOs ever get considered for something beyond the CISO role, for any other C-level? The key to being a business leader is the same keys to being an effective CISO.
So what is the difference between cyber risks and enterprise risks? So like Fry says here, is that a trick question? So traditionally, security risk management was a separate topic. Companies could have multiple risk registers, they could have multiple risk processes. You might have one for security, you might have one for the finance, you might have one for different business units, or multiple ones for different business units. But most companies are moving away from this approach. They're standardizing on a single enterprise risk management framework. And here, the language is about probability. It's about impact to the business. It's not about CVEs or CVSS scores. To be truly effective, the criticality of incidents really needs to be examined through the eyes of the business, not only through the security lens. So a few months ago, I was actually in a big conference room with the security team, and the enterprise risk management individual for this company was presenting on this new enterprise risk management framework. So this was a company who had multiple risk management frameworks. It was pretty ad hoc. It was deployed across different parts of the business and run very, very differently. And so the company had decided they were going to standardize. And so the enterprise risk management team had built up this process, and all of these different risk management processes were going to now be embedded into this one enterprise process. And so the security team was now listening to this for the first time to formalize how security was going to be built into this new enterprise risk management program. And at first, they were engaged. They were really interested. They looked at this as being a big thing. This was a real way to elevate cyber risks above the security silo that they had been in previously. But when it came down to the criticality matrix, when the business was saying, these are the things that are important to our business, the metrics were along the lines of loss of life. The losses in terms of hundreds of millions of dollars or billions of dollars of loss. And for this company, the way that they operated, it would be almost impossible for any kind of security incident to actually lead to real loss of life. It would be highly unlikely for any security incident, even the worst security incident for this company, to really get to billions and billions of dollars of losses. And so looking around, I could see the security people, it was almost like their minds were being blown, because this was essentially telling them that the things that they felt were important aren't necessarily important to the business. What might have been a critical security risk before maybe could have been a medium risk at best, but most likely was going to be a low risk based on this new criticality matrix. And people in the room started getting very, very uncomfortable. But you know what? This was actually the right approach. This is an evidence of the business itself saying, this is what's important to us as a business. And this is the terminology that we're using, and this is how we're looking at criticality, and everything needs to align to that. And so as security professionals, that can be a hard pill to swallow to say, oh, this is something that's important. There's a 0-day that's out there. We need to patch this. Everyone needs to drop what they're doing. That's how a lot of people, especially if you're a security professional, have traditionally felt. But you really need to start taking a step back and looking at the business and saying, okay, is this truly critical? Do we have mitigating controls that might prevent an attacker from actually exploiting the 0-day? That's where you can really be able to help drive the business, and that's where you can learn to talk in the language of the business.
So that's the great point there, Lyle. And we're on the cusp of having another moment here with AI. Oh, it's a new risk. How are we going to treat it? But the thing is, whether it's cloud or multi-cloud, or maybe it's executive kidnapping, or liquidity risk, or credit risk, your enterprise risk management team, they look at all the risk and present them to the board as one set of risks. And they may use a methodology like FAIR, or maybe ISO. And so there's a structure and the risk register, and it's probability and impact. But there's three things in the end analysis that are going to happen. You know them. We're going to accept the risk, we're going to transfer the risk with insurance, or we're going to try to mitigate it. But that's the language that all the board understands. And so whatever happens with technology, the business is going to react to it in the ways that they have every other risk that's ever been since the beginning of time. And that's a key thing for CISOs to know, that whatever technology change happens, that's the language they need to be very clear about.
So what do execs and boards of directors actually expect from security?
Yep. So let me take you back again to my first week at World Fuel. Not just with the CFO, but now it's the CEO. And he sees me walking down the hall being introduced, and he comes out of his door, "Hey, Tim, are we secure?" And I did not have a really prepared answer. It was day 3. I'd just come out of new hire orientation. And to cut to the chase of the point, the CEO, Michael Kasbar, was not asking me if we had an APT or an UNC group, or if I knew if our controls work. You know what he was asking me? "Tim, do you know what you're doing? Are you competent? And do you have a plan?" And so when you present risks, you got to come with a plan. You got to look like you have it under control. And it doesn't matter whether it's a real incident or a red team and you have findings all over the place, you have to stay composed and be able to speak about your plan, your recommendations. Don't just drop problems in their laps. When I was at the University of Miami and I was named CISO, the application development vice president came in and said, "Tim, shut the door. We have a problem. Every time I talk to your director of IT and we're trying to do secure inbound and outbound transmissions, she's making me guess at what you're going to find acceptable." So we talk about IPsec, and she says, "No, that's not going to work." I don't need that. What I need is a partner who's going to help solution with me about how to fix it. And I said, "I'm going to be that partner." Jack, I don't want to say his name, but I went back to my team, and they were like, "Well, Tim, just remember, if you start recommending the solution, how are you going to be independent and validated?" And I said, "My role here is not to stand outside of the football game like I'm the referee. Yeah, I'm on the field, and I am here to be part of the solution." And that makes me invested in whatever the outcome is. And so that's what the point of being involved with the solution is all about, and helping your business figure out their solutions. Telling your story with numbers. The language of the board and the language of the business is accounting. My CIO in my last CISO role, he told me, "Tim, I hope we have a good ROI in whatever it is you choose to go after." I said, "Well, what do you mean by that, CIO?" He said, "Well, in my last role, we found that after hours, we had the cleaning staff that were calling," is in Miami, "are calling Cuba and Haiti. And they've run up a bill for $13,000. And so our CIO, he asked the internal audit team, "How much did it cost you to validate those findings?" And they said $87,000. And so my CIO goes, "So you spent $87,000 and found a $13,000 problem? Tell you what, I think we let everyone start calling Haiti and Cuba."
Yeah, and many of us who are security professionals really look at security best practices as the goal. You walk in, you're talking to a company, you're moving into a new CISO role, you know what good looks like. But trying to actually force best practices verbatim, it's going to fail. That's why we keep harping on the point of learning the business, learning and understanding the language of the business. I'm sure a lot of people in here can recite security metrics like mean time to detect or mean time to respond. Those are things that you understand, they're important to you, but it might not necessarily be the right language and the right forum for the business itself. So there's a healthcare organization that I was working with, and the most important metric for them were serious patient incidents. And that was the #1 goal. That's what was reported on in all of the important management meetings, leadership, boards of directors. That was the one key metric that they cared about. And so when we started talking about building a cybersecurity metrics program and the metrics that they cared about, we came in with the typical, these are the best practices. These are the things you want to collect. These are the things that you want to do. It could be programmatic. It could be operational. It could be focused on incidents. And they looked at the incidents and like, oh, well, that terminology is all wrong. That doesn't resonate here. That's not what we understand. We care about significant patient incidents. You need to actually quantify and measure security significant incidents. And so we actually had to come up with metrics that we'd be able to collect and report on that actually wasn't just called this significant impact and significant incidents, but actually looked exactly the same. The slides, the graphics that we used, everything about it looked exactly the same as the healthcare metrics that were super important for this large healthcare organization. Now, all we're doing is we're just feeding in security numbers on top of that too, and that's what really resonated with the business. That's when they said, oh, okay, I get it. This is important. This is something that we can actually use.
So, if there was any question in your mind that cybersecurity is now a board-level issue, the SEC has removed all ambiguity. On July 26th of this year, a document that's been in the water supply and the cyber community and the financial circles since 2011 actually came to fruition. And what did it say? You have a material breach, you've got 4 days to disclose. In your 10K, you got 4 days. And you get an exemption if it's national security, that you would hurt the country if you disclosed, or if there's a life safety issue, if somebody's gonna die because you disclose. But under no case do you get an exemption past 60 days. Second thing that they said is that you have to actually disclose how you assess, identify, and manage material risks. Now that process can't start after you've had a breach. Oh, now we're gonna, you can't like turn back time, like, some time machine and say, oh, look what we've been doing all along. This is something that needs to start now. And how are those cyber risks being classified and who's in the room evaluating them? Is your board able to say, I had no idea? Or are they in the mix? So recently, Mandiant, among our best and brightest, produced a blog, and they said there's 7 things that you could prepare yourself. 1, try to have a cohesive, documented, written response strategy to a breach, something that's updated. The footer date can't be 2016. What are you going to do? And when they come to interview you, does everyone know their role? Or are they going to be caught flat-footed, not even saying they know about the document or your strategy? 2, review and enhance your cyber management process. Know what your risks are. Know that there's regular discussions about them. Have those minutes. Have that evidence that you are doing this as a regular basis, and this was just, inevitability, and at some point we're all going to get our turn in the barrel. 3rd, do you know your crown jewels? Do you know what's important to your business? Is there some general notion, or is it documented and regularly updated? 4th, review your plans and playbooks. Is there a regular cycle and discipline of iteration? 5, test your readiness, test your readiness, test your readiness. Do a red team, do a purple team. Show evidence that you're finding things and you're remediating them. That shows health. 6th, map your stakeholder custom channels. There are companies who have made a breach worse because investor relations, public relations, executives were not on the same page saying different things. The media picked up on it, and it will divide you. You have to know how you're going to communicate and what is ground truth and who is authorized to speak on behalf of the company. To try to figure that out in the moment when tensions are high and the pressure is on, that is not the time for it. And finally, 7th, identify your ecosystem of responding partners. Who is your cyber counsel going to be? When are you going to talk to your insurance broker or your insurance carrier? Who is going to be there for external public relations? Do you have contacts at the FBI if it happens to be a ransomware event and you want to negotiate? Anyway, the thing that companies need to understand is cyber is not for the CISO. Cyber is for the business. And that message is now been put into documentation. December 15th, all public companies need to comply, smaller public companies by next June. So this is evidence that what we're telling you, that we're not going to treat cyber as this functional kind of offshoot. If you're a digital company, cyber is the conversation at the board.
So common challenges in communicating cyber risk. So like we mentioned before, there's a lot of lumps that we've taken over our careers in trying to actually work with boards of directors, leadership, and many security professionals, especially if you're coming from a technical background, you really tend to go back to actually talking about things with technical terms. You know, those are things that you're comfortable with. You kind of revert to it. But you need to really, again, know your audience and tailor the message. So executives, they don't care about APTs or UNC groups or the latest threat group that's happening right now. What they do care about are the threats that are going to be relevant for the organization. You know, they care about potential impacts to the business and the likelihood of that risk. So you don't need to have different talk tracks for the board that you're going to have completely separate messages. But what you do need to have is different talk tracks for lots of individuals that you talk to. So the way that you communicate out to your team needs to be different than the way that you communicate out to your leadership, your boss, boards of directors. You can't use the same slide decks over and over and over again. Some of the content and the core content can be the same, but you really need to make sure that you are tailoring that message for every single audience member that you're talking to, and that you actually understand what is it that they're looking to know, what is it that they actually care about, and then you can tailor the security content that you're trying to convey into those terms. Now, again, lots of times you have a very, very limited amount of time. Times that I've gone in front of boards of directors, I might actually only have 5 minutes, 10 minutes, maybe 15 minutes tops, and that includes questions. And so you really need to make sure that you are being very clear and prescriptive in what you're trying to deliver the message to, let's say, boards of directors. Especially, boards of directors, they typically don't have people who are technical professionals. There might be one person or two people on a board who may have been on another board that had a breach. And so since they've been through some breach, they're looked at by the rest of the board as being the experts. And so the rest of the board just simply defers to them because they've had slightly more experience. So identify those people. Find those people in the audience who the rest of the board are actually going to defer to, or those are the people who are going to ask questions, and spend some time with them in advance. Make sure that they understand what you're trying to do. Make sure that they understand where you're trying to go. And that way, they're going to actually be able to ask you better questions as well, and it makes for a better meeting.
All right. So compliance is not security, right? GLBA, FERPA, FedRAMP, ISO, PCI, look like NASCAR with all the certifications. You've got them all, and the board has some sense of confidence that we must be secure because we're compliant. First time I ever met a Mandiant principal consultant, he said, Tim, it's great you're working on that PCI compliance. You know, every retail customer that we've ever responded to on an incident response was PCI compliant. And I said, thanks for the tip. When you're secure, you're compliant. But just because you're compliant doesn't make you secure. Make sure your board and your leadership have a false sense of security because they're compliant.
Yeah, and the same thing also holds true for maturity as well. So most companies will have maturity assessments, and most security consulting organizations go and do lots of these kinds of maturity assessments as well. And so what is maturity? Maturity at the highest level is really, do you have documentation? Do you follow the documentation? How often do you update the documentation? So that's good, that's important. That doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to be secure. And so it's important to really drive that effectiveness, to really understand, how do I really measure the effectiveness? How do I measure the effectiveness of my security controls? How do I report on that in a way that's meaningful to the leadership so that I can actually show that, yes, we're compliant here, we have HIPAA, PCI, whatever it might be. We have maturity scores. We've gone from a 3.1 to a 3.5 on the NIST scale. But also, we've actually tested our security controls, and we found that these firewalls over here, well, they were misconfigured and ports were open, but we caught it before the attackers saw it. And so we were able to identify and mitigate that damage really quickly. And I guess one other point here I'll also make is, I've been with Mandiant for about 7.5 years. One of the first conferences that I spoke at, in the panel before my panel, this person who was the CEO of McDonald's at the time was being asked about his security program. He was being asked about his security team, what does he do? And what he said to me still strikes me to this day. He said the job of his team and his job is to identify and report on risks. And then he went on to say, I didn't say the word security as part of this whatsoever. Now, he was a CISO. He ran the security team. He was responsible for the security program. But when he talks to people, he says, my job is to identify and report on risks. And security is obviously a big driver for that. But when he's looking at, this is what I do, it's really about the risk itself at a high level. And then I guess one last point here, too, is we talked about tailoring the message and having different presentations for different audiences. Keep in mind that slides will have a life of their own. Some people tend to put tons and tons of content in there to try and tell a full story. Some people will just have like a picture and then just spend 20 minutes talking to a single picture about seeing cyber risks everywhere. You have to find something in between. You have to make sure that if people are going to see your slides, because they will, slides are going to get passed around, that you're able to tell your story in a way that is going to be appropriate, that people are going to at least hopefully be able to understand what you're trying to drive towards without a whole giant block of questions.
So let's talk about 4 takeaways. And we're going to start them with the questions. Ask yourself this question: are you viewed as an enabler of the business? Or are you avoided? Are you perceived as a blocker? Left out of conversations? You're brought in at the 11th hour before you go to prod? Or do people come to you to seek out how to solve their problems?
Yeah, and so too, are you the only voice of cybersecurity in your organization? Are you the only voice of cybersecurity risk? Do you know when to use your friends or your influence, either directly or indirectly? How can you amplify that message? So it's important to understand, when do you use your voice? But your voice might actually have some limitations. So do you use a colleague? Is like Tim's message from before, was that the right way to send the message with the faculty person coming in? Yes, exactly. That was the right way to sell the message. He got MFA across. He didn't stand up and present anything to anyone, but he achieved his objective indirectly through someone else as a proxy. So you need to understand, what are your limitations? What are your limitations for the organization? What are your limitations based on your title, your role, your position? And also know when to use friends. When do you use that influence? And try and identify the right problem-solving tool for the issues that you're dealing with.
My father-in-law was a general contractor, and he would say, and it's true of cyber, if all you have in your tool bag is a hammer, every problem looks like a nail. In your presentations, in your talk tracks, in your messaging, do you have one hammer? Or in your talk tracks, do you adapt your message to your audience? Is it the same presentation over and over, regardless of the company you're in, and you're just one of these tradesmen delivering on the CISO agenda? Or is it clear that you have taken the time to consider the context of the business that you're working in?
Yeah, and then just in terms of risk, are you someone who highlights risks without providing solutions? If you're going to leadership, you can't just say, okay, here's a risk, this is bad. You actually have to give some potential solutions. You need to give them options. You need to come to the table with, here's what we can do about it. Otherwise, you're just kind of saying the sky is falling and you're never getting anywhere. So you need to make sure that that's how you're tailoring that message. Also, that it's not your responsibility to own every risk. It's not your responsibility to own every cyber risk. You're there as a trusted advisor to provide advice to the organization. And the business, though, the business leadership, they're the ones who actually make the ultimate decisions.
So in closing, winning friends and influencing people is not a popularity contest or an attempt to be. It's not high school relived. You are trying to build an effective security program. And we're talking about a movement that is bigger than you, creating a culture that's bigger than you, and embedding cybersecurity in the very DNA of the company so that people care about it as much as you do, but in their particular context. These are the things we've talked about today, about having that mindset that will allow you to communicate cyber risk to the business, to embed security by default, by design. We're now open for questions.
Tim, Lyle, thank you so much. Question over here. We do have some friends online, so we just need to make sure to use the microphone for questions.
Hi, great presentation.
Thank you.
My question is, how do you navigate the minefield of working for someone who is looking for a yes man, and you know there's a decision they're about to make that is detrimental to the security of the company?
And that is a great question. Speaking truth to power is always dangerous and can be anxiety-provoking. I think the most important thing to do is facts and data are powerful. They're immovable objects. And if you can use data to your advantage, it takes the personality out of it. And that are you an underling in this particular situation or a colleague? Okay, yeah. And I think the other thing is there may be peers that if you can get the message to use other people to be influential. That sometimes people, it matters who the messenger is sometimes. But I've found that data in the words of a faculty member at the University of Miami, they're stubborn things, facts.
Yeah, and I'd say this is a great example of where you can really try and use influence. So this is a way, especially if you don't have much authority yourself, it's really trying to find other individuals who can amplify that message for you and indirectly provide it. And so anything you can do to arm them with the right kind of data, the right kind of facts, that's the way to do it. Another approach that I found that actually works is, if someone's saying, this is what we want to do, you kind of beat around the bush a little bit and say, these are what organizations who actually are achieving this, here's what they do. These are some of the things that we need to do. And most people can read between the lines and say, this doesn't really work. There's no way for us as an organization, if these are our issues that we're dealing with right now, to actually make the jump to whatever it is that you're trying to achieve. So not everyone can necessarily understand that message, but usually if you just say, this is what's required in order to achieve the goal you're looking to do, this is where we are, these are the challenges we're facing, that gap hopefully becomes pretty obvious to people.
Study them. Find out who does get to them and influences them. Don't take the world on your shoulders. Find the person who can speak to them. Good personal advice, too.
One over here.
Hi. Yeah, really enjoyed this presentation also. I'm wondering if you have a security, you're coming into a new company and you have a security culture that, is non-existent or not very good, what do you consider as a realistic timeline, and what kind of teams or people, would you engage to help?
Yeah, that's a great question. And so a couple points there. So number one is anytime you're changing culture, it's a very, very long process. It's something where you're looking minimum 2 to 3 years, and that's something that you need to plan out as part of your roadmap. And so typically, you need to start with a foundation. Just like you're building a house, start with the foundational security elements that actually need to exist in a functional program, and then work your way up from there. A lot of people are like, oh, we need to be zero trust. But if you don't have identity access management, you don't know what your assets are, you can't do zero trust. So you start building things up to the point so that you can actually build that program, build out that culture over time. And that's a great way, I mentioned the security awareness and training. That's a great way as an intro tool to start letting people understand security concepts, how security is part of their job. Again, it used to be security was a silo in its own. Now security is really embedded with how businesses operate. And people really need to understand that, and they need to be helped to understand how that actually works for their own career, their own role.
I would add only 2 things. I had an executive recruiter tell me one time, the fish stinks from the head. He was trying to get me to leave a particular organization to go to another one, but anyway, you need to get the leadership team involved. And then I would say the second thing, you don't need to look far for use cases of, yet for the grace of God, you could have been this company. You could have been this company. And I think those contextual things, it takes you out of the influencer kind of thing and say, look, this is not hypothetical. This is not a game or some type of just simulation. There are companies every day that are having an existential crisis and they don't know if they're coming back. This is why this is important. Now that sounds a little bit like fear, uncertainty, and doubt, and that may be where it starts. Our only point is you've got to update your message 18 months, 2 years later, because they will be numb to your fear, uncertainty, and doubt if you don't show how you're adding value and creating competitive advantage and making a difference in innovation. Then you've got their ear for the long term. But yes, it may need to start with shock and awe.
Was that a stinky fish with an F or a PH?
It's an F.
We're at time, but I'm going to allow one final question if y'all are okay with that.
Sure. Thanks.
Hey, thanks for the great conversation, guys. So seeing how security is a team sport, how have you found CISOs be successful in institutionalizing this mentality on their teams and enabling, their own teams to have the same mindset as you've been discussing?
So one of the things we've done is have rotations within the security team to be able to be embedded with the business and also to bring along business leaders that are adjacent and then grow the program out from those friends to be able to have shared goals and shared objectives. At World Fuel, we used OKRs, objectives and key results. And so the more we could learn about the business, the more our cyber team could see how they connect with that. And for example, that's where we learned to create not just our metrics, but metrics that they were following and found relevant to. HR was a big one, just in terms of turning on and enabling and disabling access. And how quickly are we doing that?
Yeah, then another thing I'll just say is also a trickle-down approach. So some people who are security professionals struggle to understand the business, understand the language of the business. And so as you as a CISO, you bring some of your direct reports, bring some of your directors to some of these business meetings where they can just observe. And then once they start being in some of these meetings, seeing how the business talks about things, they can go back to their own teams. They can go back to their managers. They can go back to other people in their org and start using that business as well. And that's a good way to take some of that business culture, that business language, and permeate that through the security team.
One last thing on that. Through our SIMs, there's a perspective we have on the way a business operates that no one else in the company has. For example, when I was at ChinMed, we could see in our Okta portal who was putting their password in the username section or retyping. It was amazing what we saw, the behavior. And anyway, it pointed to training gaps and problems. And so getting your cyber team to think outside of just the cyber context of how that information about poor process and poor behavior drives what needs to be happening in the business for it to be more efficient can be a very powerful moment where your cyber team all of a sudden sees, wow, I'm not just protecting the company, I'm actually making it better because I have ground truth knowledge about what's really happening.
Awesome, gentlemen. Thank you so much. One more round of applause for Tim and Lyle.